Two men walk into a YMCA handball court on 4th Avenue. One of them is a 135-pound kid who used to run with a gang back in Kowloon. The other trained Shimpurin karate in secret in the mountains and on the beaches, back when the American occupation had outlawed Japanese martial arts entirely. A 2-time black belt. Nobody's idea of an easy fight, but only one of them walks out of that room the same person he walked in as. 11 seconds. That's how long it took. Before Oakland, before Enter the Dragon, before Be Water My Friend ends up on 1 million dorm room posters, there was Seattle. And Seattle is where I want to start. All right, so here's something that bugs me about basically every Bruce Lee documentary that I've ever watched, including, if I'm being honest, even some of my early videos here on YouTube. See, everybody rushes past Seattle. You get maybe 90 seconds. Bruce moved to America, he worked in a restaurant, and then boom, he's off to Oakland, the Wong Jack Man fight. Oh, look, Bruce Lee's in Hollywood. And look, I get it. Washing dishes isn't exactly cinematic or something that's even exciting to tell.
I can always use a good dishwasher.
But here's what I think people are missing. The Bruce Lee who walked into that YMCA in 1960 was not the same person who got off the boat in 1959. And if you don't understand what happened in those 14 months, you don't actually understand where Be Water even came from. You don't understand why this kid ends up teaching anybody who shows up sincere, black, Japanese, white, look, it didn't matter. Which, by the way, in 1959, look, that's not a small thing to do. That gets you disowned by half of Seattle's Chinatown. So look, y'all, I've spent a lot of time in this, training under people who had to build their own versions of something because what they inherited was incomplete. Because if we're being honest, look, that's basically what happened to Bruce Lee when he's in Seattle. And I don't think it's an accident that the guy who never got to finish his Wing Chun training under Grandmaster Yip Man is the same guy who ended up saying no way as a way. You build your own system when you've been cut off from finishing someone else's. So let's rewind it back. September 1959. My mom is all of what, like 9 months old at this point. A kid who's been kicked out of Hong Kong, not exiled dramatically, just sent away before the police caught up with him. He gets off a boat and then somebody drives him north to Seattle. He's got $100, a weight class victory from a high school boxing tournament back in Hong Kong, a Cha-Cha championship trophy that he couldn't even bring with him. And he's about to spend the next year getting completely rebuilt. But here's where he actually lands. A walk-in closet-sized attic room above a restaurant owned by Ruby Chow on First Hill. Not in Chinatown, but First Hill. Ruby Chow made a point of that. She'd opened the first Chinese restaurant in Seattle outside of Chinatown back in 1948, which, if you know anything about how segregated this country still was in the late 50s, that was its own quiet act of defiance. So Ruby and her husband Ping knew Bruce's father from the Cantonese opera circuit back in Hong Kong. So this wasn't charity exactly, it was the old system. You take care of your friend's kid, you put a roof over his head, you give him a job, and you keep him out of trouble. The job was as a busboy and a waiter. And I want to sit on this for a second because I think it's the most underrated part of the whole Seattle story. This is a kid who a year earlier was a working child actor in Hong Kong, semi-famous. People recognized him on the street. Look, that's Lee Xiaolong. You know, he got that name from his child acting career. He had servants in his house growing up. That's just the truth of the family that he came from. But now he's bussing tables for rich white people who talk down to him in a city where he doesn't even fully speak the language yet, and he's living in a room with no windows. He described it later as feeling like an indentured servant. That's not me being dramatic. Those are Bruce's actual words. And if you've ever trained seriously in anything, you know status does something to your nervous system. It changes how you carry yourself. how quick you are to react. Strip a proud 18-year-old of all of it all at once, his fame, his class, his home turf, even the language that he thinks in, and you'd expect an explosion. Frankly, in Hong Kong, that's exactly what you got out of him. Constant fights, a name on a police blacklist. That's the actual reason he's on this boat in the first place. It wasn't some vague, oh, Bruce Lee got sent to America for opportunity story that some people like to tell. So the obvious question is, well, what stopped the explosion happening again 3,000 miles from home with nobody around to bail him out? Well, it was two things, and this is the part that I think people like to skip past too fast. First, it was Ruby Chow. Now, people love to paint her as just a strict landlord in this story, and sure, by every account, she and Bruce clash constantly. I think even Bruce referred to her as the Dragon Lady a few times. But it really was a case of strong personality meets strong personality. But I actually think that friction did something useful. He had to learn to eat the disrespect from customers and not throw a punch, because if he did, he loses the roof over his head and he probably gets sent straight back to the exact situation his parents shipped him out of to avoid. For the first time in his life, there were real consequences waiting on the other side of his temper. That's not nothing. Second, there was school. Within a week of landing in Seattle, he's enrolled at Edison Technical School to finish the high school diploma that he really didn't take seriously when he was in Hong Kong. And Edison Tech is where this whole story actually starts moving, because that's where he meets a judoka named Jesse Glover. Brown belt at the time, not black belt yet. Though don't let that fool you about what he could do on that mat. Now I'll get into Jesse Glover properly in the next chapter, because what happens between those two, a black judoka 6 years older than Bruce, a former gang kid himself, that relationship is where you actually start seeing the outline of the guy who's eventually going to walk into that handball court. But hey, before we get there, I want you to just sit with where he is at this exact moment. He's stripped of status. He's working a job he hates for a woman that he can't out-argue. He's barely finished translating a sentence in his head before he has to speak it out loud in English. And he's about to become the most famous martial artist who ever lived. But right now, he's just a kid that nobody in this city has any reason to notice. And that gap between who he is in September of 1959 and who he's gonna be by the time he steps into that handball court, that's our whole episode. That's what we're doing here. So who is this guy? Jesse Glover is 6, maybe 8 years older than Bruce. He grew up in Yesler Terrace, which, if you don't know Seattle, was one of the only racially integrated housing projects in the city at the time. When Jesse Glover was 12 years old, a drunk, racist cop beat him and his friend half to death, broke his jaw. He had to have it wired shut. And I want you to sit with that for a second before we move on, because it explains everything that comes after. A 12-year-old kid decides, while lying in a hospital bed with his jaw wired shut, that this can never happen to him again. So he tries to teach himself jiu-jitsu out of library books. He gets rejected by every Japanese dojo in town. They wouldn't teach a black kid, plain and simple. Eventually, he joins the Air Force, partly just to get formal judo instruction, partly to support his family. He gets discharged from service, comes back to Seattle, finally gets into the Seattle dojo, and then just dominates, wins the Pacific Northwest Judo Championships 14 years running as a brown belt, beating black belts the entire way. Look, this is not a guy who needs Bruce Lee to feel dangerous. That's a guy who's already dangerous and is starting to suspect that judo alone won't cut it in an actual street fight, which, by the way, is exactly the kind of doubt that eventually led him to fly down to Oakland just to watch a man named James Yim Lee punch a bag full of ball bearings hard enough to convince him that Kung Fu just might be the missing piece. So Jesse Glover's out there hunting for something, and in August of 1959, a month, maybe 6 weeks after Bruce Lee gets off the boat, he finds it at the Seattle Seafair Festival, watching an 18-year-old kid do the cha-cha and then rip into a Southern praying mantis form like he's trying to put his fist through the air itself. Jesse Glover doesn't approach him that day. He does something a little stranger, honestly, and I love this detail because it's such an oddly specific way to try to get someone's attention. He finds out that they go to the same school, Edison Tech, and he starts walking a few steps ahead of Bruce on the morning commute, throwing punches and kicks at telephone poles as he passes them, just performing. He's trying to get Bruce to notice him and say something, but Bruce Lee ignores it completely. Eventually, Glover just gives up on the theater and walks up and asks him straight up, "Hey, will you teach me Kung Fu?" And here's the part that I actually think matters more than the fight that's coming. Bruce Lee hesitates. And that's because if you're back in Hong Kong teaching an outsider, someone who isn't Chinese, that's not a small betrayal. That's the kind of thing that gets you cut off from your own lineage. Yip Man's whole world ran on exactly those lines. But Bruce Lee agrees, but only under one condition: total secrecy. Nobody back home can know he's teaching a Black American judo champion Kung Fu instead of, well, focusing on his high school diploma like he's supposedly here to do. But Jesse Glover, he doesn't care. He offers up his own living room. He kicks his roommates out whenever Bruce comes by. I actually think that condition, the whole secrecy thing, that tells you as much about where Bruce's head is as anything else in this whole chapter. He's not rebelling against the tradition yet, not really. He's just quietly bending it in private where nobody back home has to know. That comes later, the part where he starts saying it out loud, where he starts basically daring anyone to tell him a Black student or a Japanese student doesn't belong in his Kwoon. But right now, it's still a secret. He's testing the water before he's ready to stand in it. Well, what starts as one secret lesson in a living room turns into something much bigger, much faster than either of them probably expected. Within 6 months, it's Ed Hart, 6'4", 260 pounds, a professional boxer who could probably have killed most men with one hand. Then there was Howard Hall, then James DeMille, 100+ undefeated fights in Air Force boxing. Then in early 1960, a 38-year-old Japanese-American man named Taki Kimura, who's carrying something so much heavier than anyone else in that room and who's gonna become the closest thing Bruce Lee ever had to a best friend in America. Jesse Glover himself put it best, and I think it's worth quoting him directly here rather than paraphrasing, because he said it plainer than I ever could, that Bruce Lee reacted to him first as a friend and second as a teacher. That's not how Kung Fu is supposed to work. That's not how anything back in Hong Kong worked. There's no Sifu who lets his students call him full of crap to his face, but that's exactly what this group did constantly, and Bruce let them. By 1960, this ragtag group of judo champions and boxers and former gang kids, Black, Japanese, white, and a few others besides, they'd basically become Bruce's entire social world in America. His own students started calling it, half-jokingly, the United Nations. There's one more person who walks into this picture in February of 1960, and honestly, I think what happens between him and Bruce might be the single most important relationship of this entire Seattle chapter. His name, as we've already stated, is Taki Kimura. Bruce meets him on a school football field. Taki's 38 years old at the time, twice Bruce's age, and he is, by every account, a wreck of a man, not physically, but psychologically. 18 years earlier, when Taki was a teenager, one day short of his own high school graduation, the US government rounded up his entire family and shipped them to an internment camp purely because of their Japanese ancestry. Tule Lake first, then Minidoka, years of it. He comes out the other side of that with no high school diploma, no path to college, and from what his own accounts describe, no self-worth left at all. By the time he's in his late 30s, he's working a quiet job in a grocery store, carrying a level of depression and defeat that never really lifted. Now I'm going to hold off on the full story of what Bruce Lee does for this man because it deserves its own real estate later in this episode, not a rush section here. But I want you to remember his name, Taki Kimura, because everything I'm about to tell you about how Seattle changed Bruce Lee, you're going to see it proven more than in almost anyone else in what happens to this quiet, broken 38-year-old over the following months. Okay, so here's where I think this story really starts. Not the fight, but this. Because up to this point, Bruce is still basically a kid who's showing off. He's got one student, then two, then a handful. And if I'm being honest, there's an ego component to all of it early on. He's good. He knows he's good. And it feels good to have people watch him be good. That's not a criticism. I mean, show me an 18-year-old who wouldn't feel that way. But something starts to shift once the group actually starts to grow. Ed Hart joins, 6'4", 260 pounds, a professional boxer who genuinely intimidated most rooms he walked into. Then Howard Hall, then James DeMille, who'd gone through the Air Force with 100 undefeated boxing matches to his name. Look, these aren't hobbyists looking for a fun Tuesday night activity. These are serious, physically dangerous men choosing to hand Bruce Lee authority over how they train to fight. And I think that does something to a person. Being the guy other dangerous men choose to follow is a completely different psychological position than being the guy who happens to be the best fighter in the room. One's a status, the other's a responsibility. You can actually see this shift show up in how he starts teaching. This isn't some romanticized detail. Bruce genuinely pioneers his own training methodology here, stuff that's honestly ahead of its time for a homemade martial arts class in somebody's basement in 1960. He starts using Polaroid photographs to break down his students' sparring, snaps a picture mid-exchange, and physically draws arrows and notes right on the photo. Guards too low here, angles wrong there. That's not something you do if you're just showing off. That is someone actually trying to build people, not just perform in front of them. And here's the part that I think really marks the turn from fighter to teacher. Because see, Bruce is desperate to get out of Ruby Chow's kitchen. The menial labor, the subservience, all of it grinding him down every single day. And instead of just quitting and figuring it out alone, it's Taki Kimura and Jesse Glover who organized the group. 10 of the charter students pledged $10 a month each, pulling together the $100 in rent for a rundown little storefront in Chinatown. A real school. Bruce's first school. And that's not Bruce achieving something on his own. That's a community deciding this man is worth investing in, literally, with their finances, because of what he's already started giving them. I don't think you get from kid who fled Hong Kong one step ahead of the police to the guy who becomes Bruce Lee without a moment like this one. Somebody has to actually need you first. Somebody has to be dependent on you before responsibility becomes real instead of theoretical. That's Seattle doing exactly what Hong Kong never got the chance to do. And here's the thing about that storefront school and about the whole group by extension. It did not look anything like Bruce would have ever encountered back home. Jesse Glover himself described it later, and I'll just tell it to you the way he did. The group included Black students, white students, Japanese American students, some Chinese students, Hispanic students, Mexican, Norwegian, Filipino, Irish, English, Native American backgrounds. And they were all training together in the same room in a city and a country that was still very much segregated in 1960. And I want to be careful here because I don't want to overstate this into some kind of saintly colorblind fantasy. Bruce wasn't some enlightened outlier floating above his era, but he did make a very specific, very deliberate choice that a lot of traditional teachers of that period simply refused to make. He wrote it out himself plainly. No matter if your color is black or white, red or blue, I could still make friends with you without any barriers. And then he actually lived it, teaching a black judo champion who'd been turned away from every Japanese dojo in town, specifically because of his race. Jesse Glover, remember, had been rejected outright more than once by dojos that wouldn't teach him for exactly that reason. Bruce didn't just tolerate that history, he built his entire American teaching career in direct opposition to it. And this cuts both ways, which I think is the more interesting half of the story. Bruce wasn't just handing down kung fu from on high, his students were actively teaching him how to live in this country. Ed Hart helped him with his English and history homework. Leroy Garcia taught him how to drive, badly by every account. Bruce apparently drove like an actual menace and took him out to the mountains to shoot pistols and rifles for the first time in his life. Jesse Glover and Fred Sato taught him judo throws and sweeps that he folded directly into his own fighting method. The 5 ways of attacking Jeet Kune Do, according to Jesse Glover, actually came from judo and conversations that Bruce had with Fred Sato. So look, that's not a master dispensing wisdom downward. That's a genuine exchange in both directions between a Hong Kong immigrant and a group of Americans from backgrounds that he never once had a reason to encounter back home. And this, I think, is where you start to see the actual seed of something much bigger. It's where you start to see the instinct to take whatever works, regardless of where it came from or what tradition it's supposed to violate. Judo throws bolted on the Wing Chun trapping, Western boxing footwork studied alongside Southern praying mantis. That instinct doesn't show up later in some fully formed Jeet Kune Do philosophy statement. It starts here in a rundown storefront in Chinatown with a room full of people who, back in Hong Kong, he'd have had no reason to ever train alongside at all, much less even meet. There's one more piece of this transformation that I think gets skipped over constantly, and it's such a small human detail that I actually love it more than most of the big dramatic ones. And this was something that I never even knew until I started this project. But yo, Bruce was terrified of public speaking. Not nervous, terrified. His English was heavily accented. He thought too fast for his own mouth to keep up, and he had a genuine stutter, one that showed up hardest of all things on the letter J, which is deeply unfortunate because, his first student's name was Jesse. And by Jesse Glover's own account, Bruce could never once get through his name in one clean attempt the entire time they knew each other. And when Bruce got nervous in front of a crowd, he had this one specific, almost aggressive habit. He'd lock eyes with a single person in the audience and just stare like it was a challenge, which, if you think about it, makes sense for a street fighter. Because that's exactly the kind of eye contact you use before a fight, but not before a lecture. It's the wrong tool for the room, and it made him come across as confrontational when he wasn't trying to be. But it turns out that Jesse Glover is the one who fixes this. He coaches him patiently over months to stop staring people down and instead just pick a few spots at the back of the room and scan across them. That's it. That's the whole trick. And it apparently just works. Bruce's fear of public speaking doesn't just fade. It flips entirely to the point where he starts actively seeking out more opportunities to get up in front of crowds. And that matters because by now he's doing exactly that constantly. Seafair, high school demonstrations and lectures, the University of Washington. And once he's actually comfortable holding a room, he stops just demonstrating technique and starts doing something much more dangerous. Because he starts lecturing them on why everyone else's approach to martial arts is completely wrong. This is where it gets good, y'all. He calls traditional forms and rigid stances the classical mess, openly, in public, to rooms that sometimes include the exact traditionalists that he's criticizing. He's not doing this to provoke anyone, not particularly. His ideas are just genuinely, fundamentally different from what most of the room grew up believing, and he's not the type to keep an opinion like that to himself once he's found his voice. So you've got a formerly terrified stutterer who's now comfortable enough on a stage to publicly declare that soft, fluid internal styles beat hard external ones like karate. Flat out, no hedging. And that's a hell of a thing to say out loud in a room that might contain the very people who've spent their whole lives mastering the styles that he's dismissing. It's also, as it turns out, exactly what happens next. By late 1960, Bruce isn't just teaching in secret out of Jesse Glover's living room anymore. He's outgrown that completely. He's given public demonstrations, the Seafair Festival, high schools, the University of Washington, wherever anyone will give him a stage. And here's the thing about Bruce Lee at this point in his life. Give this guy a microphone and he's gonna say something that gets him in trouble. That's not a bug. That's basically the whole personality. So somewhere in the University District one day, a flyer goes up advertising one of these demonstrations at Edison Technical School. And buried in the description, almost as an afterthought, it mentions that the demo is going to include some judo. And that one word on the flyer is the whole reason this story happens. Because across town, there's a martial arts teacher named Yuichi Nakachi who runs the classes in the University District and at the downtown YMCA. A very serious guy, a legitimate one, started training Shimburen karate back in Japan at 12 years old in secret in the mountains because the American occupation had outlawed the whole art. Already a second-degree black belt by the time his own instructor left the country, this isn't some pretender. Nakachi sees judo on that flyer and decides it's worth the trip, so he shows up with a handful of his own students. And here's where it gets interesting, because sitting somewhere in that gymnasium, already having quietly switched sides, is a Japanese exchange student named Masafusa Kimura, not to be confused with Taki Kimura. Now I want to slow down on this guy for a second because I think he's the most underrated character in the entire Nakachi story. Masafusa Kimura and another Japanese black belt, a guy named Tak Miyabi, used to train together at the downtown YMCA. So one day they're going through their own karate and judo practice and they notice Bruce off in a corner working a form that they don't recognize. Masafusa Kimura walks over and asks what it is. Bruce Lee tells him, "I'm doing Chinese boxing," and he just invites him to come to the next session with the group. That's it. That's the whole audition. Kimura ends up integrated enough into the circle that he's actually standing in several of the 1960 group photos, right alongside Bruce Lee, Jesse Glover, Ed Hart, Skip Ellsworth, like he's one of the guys. Which makes what happens next sting a little more. By the time this demonstration rolls around, Kimura's already showing up as one of Nakachi's guys instead. And that's not a small betrayal in a scene this small. And Bruce Lee's friend Ed Hart, who's standing right there for basically the entire build up to this fight, always suspected Kimura wasn't just switching sides quietly. He thought that Masafusa Kimura was playing both sides. One minute he's telling Yuichi Nakachi one thing, the next minute he's telling Bruce Lee another. He's deliberately stoking it until a fight became unavoidable. Now look, I don't know if that's true. Nobody can know that for certain because all of these people are dead now. But I find it fascinating that the guy who trained with Bruce Lee defected to the other camp and then allegedly worked both rooms to make sure this thing actually happened. That guy, he gets almost no attention in how this story usually gets told. Everybody just remembers Bruce Lee and Yuichi Nakachi, but almost nobody remembers Masafusa Kimura. One more thing about this guy, since we won't be coming back to this later. Masafusa Kimura didn't stick around in America. Years afterward, in a letter to a completely different Kimura, Taki Kimura, his best student and closest friend by that point, Bruce Lee mentions someone else getting into trouble and, almost in passing, says the guy made the same fate as Masafusa and got himself deported. That's the last anybody hears of him in this story. So a guy who gets invited into Bruce Lee's inner circle over a curious question at the YMCA ends up quietly betraying him a year later. And then he disappears out of the country entirely, and Bruce just mentions it years later like a footnote. So that demonstration, let's get back to that. Well, Bruce Lee gets up, and being Bruce, he doesn't just show off his hands, he starts lecturing. He tells the room flat out that the soft internal styles, the Chinese approach that he's teaching, are simply superior to the hard external styles, karate, judo, all of it. Now, if you've trained in more than one system, you already know how loaded a statement like that is. Hard versus soft isn't just a technique preference, it's practically a religious argument in martial arts circles, and it still is. Honestly, people get heated about internal versus external the same way today, but in a room that includes multiple karate and judo black belts, standing in front of the exact style that he's putting down, Nakachi does not take it well at all. And he's already sitting on a grudge, by the way, that has nothing to do with any of this. For months, Nakachi's been sparring judo at the YMCA against one of Bruce Lee's own students, Jesse Glover, and despite holding a black belt against Glover's mere first degree brown, Nakachi keeps getting thrown by Jesse. Not once, not twice, but over and over again. He tells himself it's because Glover's just physically stronger. He refuses to credit him with any actual skill. That's already sitting there unresolved. And when Bruce gets up and tells an entire room that everything Nakachi spent his whole life mastering is the inferior approach, Nakachi's offended. Genuinely, personally offended, and this surprised me a little when I first dug into it, he doesn't challenge Bruce Lee on the spot. He lets it simmer. It takes a second demonstration several days later to actually light the fuse. On October 28, 1960, Bruce does another public demo, this time at the Yesler Terrace Gymnasium. Same message, probably even more confident delivery by now. And this time, Yuichi Nakachi's had enough. He sends a friend over to formally challenge Bruce. Bruce's own students think the whole thing is beneath him. Some guy sending a messenger instead of speaking up himself, so Bruce just ignores it. He walks away. Which, if you know anything about how these situations usually go, that doesn't end it. It just changes the venue. So Nakachi starts showing up at Edison Tech every morning, standing in the student lounge, staring, sneering, gesturing for Bruce to come fight. He's blocking him in the hallways. And I want to be clear, Edison Tech at this point isn't some closed campus where you need a student ID badge to walk into. It's a downtown adult vocational school. They got night classes, GED students, working adults finishing diplomas. That's literally the whole reason an 18-year-old immigrant with no U.S. high school credit could enroll there in the first place. So there's nothing stopping a 29-year-old teacher from a completely different school from just walking the halls whenever he wants. He already knows the building. He's been there once already for the first demo. And here's what actually impresses me about Bruce in this stretch, because it's so far from the image that people have of him, and it's so different from how he was just a few years earlier in Hong Kong. He doesn't take the bait. He smiles. He walks around Nakachi. He tells his friends over and over that fighting over what amounts to a philosophical disagreement is pointless. That word, pointless, apparently came up constantly. This is a guy holding real restraint for weeks against someone actively trying to provoke him in public, daily. But Nakachi's smarter than a pure stalking campaign, or at least meaner. When direct provocation doesn't work, he starts working the room instead. He goes around town, including at his own home turf, the downtown YMCA, bragging that Bruce Lee backed down from his challenge. He said Bruce Lee wouldn't fight him. He's scared. Well, that gets back to Seattle's Chinese martial arts community fast, and they do not take it well. To them, this isn't just Bruce's personal business anymore. His passivity reads as an insult to Chinese Kung Fu itself. Several practitioners actually tell him that if he won't fight Nakachi, they will fight on his behalf. Which, if you think about it, is its own kind of pressure, worse maybe than Nakachi's. Bruce stubbornly refuses to let anyone push him into it for a while. But then it gets physical and personal almost at the same time. Now, there are two accounts of exactly what breaks him, and I think rather than trying to pick a winner, the more honest read is that they're not actually completing, they're compounding. The first, Bruce later told a student named Joel Cowles that the real turning point happened in the student lounge when Nakachi walked straight up, got in his face, and shoved him aside on his way past. Bruce's own words on it were simple. As long as he talked, I just let him talk. But when he put his hands on me, then I accepted his challenge. Now the second, and this is according to Jesse Glover and another friend, Leroy Garcia, that Nakachi sent word through a friend that if Bruce Lee wanted to go to the hospital, all he had to do was walk over. And then separately, Yuichi Nakachi stepped directly between Bruce Lee and a young woman he'd been talking to in the hallway just to issue the challenge in front of her. Garcia's own account of it, he challenged Bruce in front of the girl. Well, and then Bruce lost that whole philosophical bit. And I mean, this is what I think happened. I think both of them happened. Look, a shove is one kind of disrespect. It's physical, it's undeniable, but it's over in a second. But getting humiliated in front of a shorty, a chick you trying to holler at after weeks of holding your composure, look, that's a completely different kind of disrespect and a much more personal one. Either one of those alone might not have done it, but together in the same stretch of days, I think that's exactly what finally breaks a restraint that Bruce had been holding for weeks. So Bruce goes up to Jesse Glover and he tells him to set it up. Fight's on. And Glover, and I keep coming back to how smart this guy is in this whole story, he doesn't try to talk Bruce out of the fight itself, but he negotiates the conditions of it, somewhere private, somewhere that doesn't end up with Bruce Lee arrested or possibly deported for a brawl inside of a public school. He finds Yuichi Nakachi in the student lounge and proposes the downtown Seattle YMCA. Nakachi, on his own turf either way, he agrees immediately. The handball courts. Now, I've spent enough time now around people who actually understand how to de-escalate a situation without killing the intensity of it. And that's what Glover's doing here. He's not stopping the fight. He's controlling the conditions of it. The time, the place, the rules, the witnesses. But the escalation doesn't stop here though. It runs right up until the moment that they step onto that handball court. The two groups end up at the same bus stop in the rain on the way to downtown, and Nakachi, one last time, keeps drifting into Bruce's line of sight, trying to bait him into exploding right there on a public sidewalk. Bruce Lee just stares at the ground. He doesn't look up. He just holds it. And even then, on the bus itself, Nakachi tries to start dictating the terms for the fight, the rules, the restrictions, whatever version of a sporting match that he's imagining. And Bruce snaps. He yells right there on the bus, "Forget the rules because I'm going all out." And right before they walk in, Jesse Glover pulls Bruce aside one more time anyway. Bruce wants to use real Wing Chun, eye gouges, throat strikes, the stuff that isn't designed to let a man walk away afterward. And Jesse Glover talks him out of it. Empty hand strikes only, nothing designed to end somebody. And Bruce Lee agrees, reluctantly. Well, 7 people file into that YMCA handball court on 4th Avenue. But after 11 seconds, only one of them would walk out the same person he walked in as. Ed Hart raises his hand. Okay, begin. For a full second, maybe 2, nobody moves. That kind of stillness right before real violence where both men are just reading each other. Yuichi Nakachi breaks it first. A fast, linear front kick straight at Bruce's midsection. Textbook karate. The kind of kick that's supposed to end an exchange before it even starts. But Bruce doesn't retreat. And this is the part that I actually find most instructive. If you ever train anything reactive, he steps into it. He brushes the kick aside like it's nothing. And in the same motion, he's already closing the distance, which is exactly the opposite of what Yuichi Nakachi's nervous system is braced for. And then, it's just punches. A straight blast of center line strikes, one after another, no gap between them, driving forward like Bruce is trying to walk through the man instead of hit him. Nakachi never gets a guard up. He never finds an angle to slide off to. He just gets walked backwards, strike after strike, punch after punch, until his back hits the wall. His knees start to buckle. Bruce puts a final kick straight into his face, and Nakachi flips backward onto the floor. Jesse Glover, refereeing this whole thing, remembers. He screams, "No!" and physically throws himself across the room to drag Bruce off an opponent who is already down and not moving. Ed Hart's got the stopwatch, 11 seconds, start to finish. And here's the detail I actually love most in this whole fight, and it happens after the violence is already over. Yuichi Nakachi comes to on the floor, completely disoriented, and asks Bruce's students how long it lasted. And Jesse Glover, this man who just physically restrained his own teacher mid-fight, looks at a stranger that he has no reason to protect, and he lies to him. He tells him it was 22 seconds. It was 11. Glover just watched it happen, and Ed Hart had the stopwatch in his hand. But he can see what's sitting on the floor in front of him isn't just a beaten man, it's a proud one. And he decides in that moment that Yuichi Nakachi's dignity is worth more than the accuracy of the stopwatch. I think that's worth sitting with for a second before we move on, because it's actually a preview of exactly the kind of restraint that we're about to watch Bruce Lee himself choose later. And here's what nobody expects, including, I think, Bruce Lee himself. There was no celebration. The locker room afterward is heavy, tense, almost frightened. Yuichi Nakachi's skull is fractured. The break ran from his eye socket down across his cheekbone. And for several agonizing minutes, Bruce and his students genuinely don't know if the man is going to wake up at all. They're not celebrating a victory. They're standing around wondering if they just watched someone die. Now, Yuichi Nakachi obviously did come to, but the fear that sat in that room for those few minutes, it didn't just evaporate once he did. Because here's the thing about the kid who got on that boat in September of 1959. Back in Hong Kong, this is exactly the moment where he'd have been building a legend, bragging, making sure everyone in the neighborhood heard exactly what he did and to whom he did it to. And that's the currency he grew up trading in: reputation, building face, and fear. But Seattle Bruce does the opposite, the complete opposite. Yuichi Nakachi's associates and a handful of local karate practitioners push hard for a rematch. They want to reclaim some of what just got taken from them in that handball court in 11 seconds. And Bruce Lee flatly refuses. And then he goes further than that. He makes his own students swear to keep the entire fight a secret. No bragging at Edison Tech, no word of it reaching Chinatown, nothing. There are two reasons for that, and I think people usually only remember the practical one. Bruce understood exactly what kind of legal trouble he was actually in. An unlicensed bare-knuckle brawl that left a man with a fractured skull is aggravated assault, full stop, regardless of who started it. If the police ever investigated, he wasn't just facing embarrassment, he was facing arrest, a criminal prosecution, and a record that could follow him for the rest of his life. And this is right at the exact moment that he's trying to build a reputation as a teacher, not as a brawler and a street fighter. But I don't think that's actually the real reason, or at least not the whole reason. I think something in Bruce genuinely changed about what winning even meant to him. This wasn't a street fight for status anymore. It cost him something to watch a man crumple onto a gym floor and not know if he'd wake up. And you can see this exact instinct show up again years later. There's a later, quieter match against a fighter named Lao Dai Chen, where Bruce actually paid for his opponent's medical recovery out of his own pocket. And then he demanded total silence from everyone who watched, specifically to protect that other man's career. That's not a one-time reaction to a scary moment in 1960. That's a pattern. That's who he's actually become. And there's one more layer to this that I think is the most Bruce Lee thing about the entire fight. To everyone around him, Jesse Glover, Taki Kimura, Ed Hart, this was a flawless, decisive demonstration of everything he'd built. To Bruce himself, he was frustrated. His entire Wing Chun foundation is built around close-range trapping, and it worked completely against a man standing right in front of him. But what happens against someone who doesn't stand still? What happens against someone who's mobile, elusive, or working from a distance? He starts to suspect right there in the immediate afterglow of his biggest win yet that what he has is devastatingly effective and structurally incomplete both at the same time. He'd already told Jesse Glover months before this fight even happened that he considered himself little more than an advanced beginner. I used to think that was just modesty, but now I think he actually meant it, literally. And the Nakachi fight is the moment that that belief gets confirmed instead of humbled. Which brings me back to Taki Kimura. I told you guys to remember his name. By the time of this fight, Kimura's been training under Bruce Lee for the better part of that year. And here's what that year actually did to him. Before Bruce Lee, Taki Kimura was, in his own words, a wreck. A man who lost his high school graduation, his 20s, his sense of belonging in his own country. All of it stripped away in an internment camp for the crime of his Japanese ancestry. He came out the other side and just quietly kept working, quietly kept being invisible, quietly believing that he wasn't worth very much at all. But Bruce Lee didn't treat him like a broken man who needed to be handled gently. He treated him like an equal. He doesn't talk down to him despite being half his age. He writes him personal notes of encouragement. And he tells him over and over in almost exactly these words, that he is just as good as anybody else, not any better, not any worse. For a man who spent years being told by his own government that he was a threat simply for existing, I don't think I can overstate what it means to have someone, anyone, look you in the eye and mean it. Taki Kimura later called Bruce Lee his best friend, his protective younger brother, despite the age gap running backward. And within a few years, Bruce Lee trusts him enough to hand him the entire Seattle school and stand him up as his best man at his own wedding. That's not a martial arts student-teacher relationship. That's what it actually looks like when the thing you built with your hands ends up rebuilding a person. So when people ask me what actually changed Bruce Lee during those 14 months, I don't point at the 11 seconds. I point at Taki Kimura walking around Seattle with his head up for the first time in 18 years. So look, here's where I actually land on all of this. That Seattle period didn't hand Bruce Lee a black belt in maturity. He's still gonna make mistakes, plenty of them in the years that follow. This isn't a finished man who's walking off that handball court, but something real did happen there. He arrived with $100, a reputation that he was running from, and a temper that had already gotten him put on a police blacklist. 14 months later, he's teaching a black judo champion, a Japanese American internment survivor, and a Filipino cannery worker's son in the same room, at the same time, breaking a rule that had held for centuries in his own tradition. And he's not doing it because it's radical, but because it never occurred to him that it should be any other way. He's been given a responsibility for something for the first time in his life, and instead of running from it the way an 18-year-old street fighter might, he leans into it. Look, he's been publicly humiliated, stalked, and challenged, and instead of escalating the way Hong Kong Bruce always did, he tries to walk away from it for weeks. And then when he finally does fight and wins decisively in 11 seconds, he doesn't brag. He protects the other man's dignity. He protects his own community from the fallout. He looks at his own victory and he finds it wanting. That's not the street kid who got on a boat in 1959. Most people remember the Bruce Lee who shows up in Oakland a few years later, the revolutionary, the teacher who reshapes everything we think martial arts even is. But before Oakland, there was Seattle. And before Bruce Lee changed martial arts, Seattle changed Bruce Lee. Now, if you want to know exactly why I had to leave Hong Kong in the first place, why a teenager with this much talent got put on a police blacklist and shipped across an ocean before any of this could even happen, go watch The Real Reason the Triads Wanted Bruce Lee Dead. That's the video that sets this whole story up. This one starts where that one ends. But hey, let me know down in the comments if you've been in that room in 1960, which one of Bruce's students would you have wanted to train alongside? Jesse Glover, Taki Kimura, or somebody else? But while you think about that, hey, y'all keep on training, remember to breathe, and come back and holler at me on the next video.